Mrs. Dewi's original name was Nemodo Naogo. She grew up in a poor family in 1940. Her father was a carpenter. Her mother had been ill for a while. The family had to borrow money to allow Dewi to go to school. Therefore, since middle school, Mrs. Dewi had been working part-time to support the family and lessen their burden. She was diligent and smart. Later, she was admitted to a famous company, Chiyoda Life Insurance. At the same time, Mrs. Dewi hoped to become an actress so that she could earn more and change her destiny. However, in the end, she only got a small role in movies. When she was in high school, her father passed away. She was forced to leave school and work full-time. She joined the Nagasaki senior club, Copacabana. It was a famous high-end bar in the Showa period. Many political leaders and influential people often gathered there. Because of her beauty, Mrs. Dewi quickly became popular in the club. At that time, the salary of a freshman in work was 10,000 yen a month, but she could earn more than 50,000 yen tip in a night. Every day, Mrs. Dewi entertained different kinds of people. Most of them were foreigners. Therefore, in the club, she quickly mastered English and social etiquette skills of the upper class. At the age of 18, her monthly income was already over 1 million yen. She said in her book, "I think poverty is one of the greatest gifts I have received in my life. It gives me the motivation to work hard." But Mrs. Dewi was not satisfied. She was striving to be more successful. In 1959, under the introduction by a Japanese businessman, the 19-year-old Mrs. Dewi met the Indonesian President Sukarno at a tea party at the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo. When Sukarno saw her for the first time, he was attracted by her beautiful eyes. He fell in love with her at first sight and described her as a goddess of jam. After a brief conversation at the party, the two maintained a pen-friend relationship. Soon, Sukarno invited her to Indonesia as a guest. Mrs. Dewi agreed. In Indonesia, she saw how Sukarno interacted with local people and admired him. 3 years later, the 54-year-old Sukarno and the 22-year-old Mrs. Dewi got married officially. They held a simple wedding ceremony in the president's house. Mrs. Dewi became an Indonesian and was given the name Latina Sari Dewi Sukarno, which means goddess like a gem. At that time, Sukarno already had a wife and was married 3 times, but he adored Mrs. Dewi a lot. When attending international conferences or diplomatic meetings, he was always accompanied by Mrs. Dewi. She was just like the First Lady of Indonesia. Mrs. Dewi became acquainted with many political figures. In 2008, Japan's declassified diplomatic files revealed that in the 1960s, Dewi was a secret messenger between the Japanese Prime Minister and the Indonesian President Sukarno, assisting the two parties to resolve issues such as the former Japanese soldiers who were stranded in Indonesia after World War II. As she became more famous, Mrs. Dewi was under a lot of international pressure. She was rumored to be a traitor to Japan. The Japanese media called her a prostitute abandoned by Japan. Although she was far away in Indonesia, her family had to face the harassment of the media and the paparazzi. Her mother finally fell ill and died due to mental exhaustion. Her younger brother also committed suicide with gas 2 days after her mother's death. It brought great trauma to Mrs. Dewi. In 1965, a coup occurred in Indonesia. The military strongman, Suharto, took the opportunity to seize the throne. Sukarno lost the power and was placed under house arrest. Shortly afterwards, his family planned to go into exile to avoid being captured by the new government. As Mrs. Dewi was pregnant at that time, she went to the Japanese embassy in Indonesia and asked to return home. However, to prevent from having tensions with the new government, Japan did not welcome her. Eventually, she turned to France, which was more welcome to political refugees. In the same year, she gave birth to a daughter. Before exile, she had already transferred a lot of properties and money to the bank in Switzerland. So in France, she continued to live in luxury. Mrs. Dewi became a socialite in Paris. Her elegant oriental face earned her the nickname the Pearl from the Orient. She was friends with a lot of celebrities such as Alan Delon and the Beatles' Ringo Starr. She also had a good relationship with the French and Spanish nobles. In 1970, when Sukarno was critically ill, Mrs. Dewi brought their daughter to return to Indonesia to see him for the last time. Sukarno passed away 24 hours after they arrived. Since then, Mrs. Dewi raised their daughter independently. In 1980, she moved to New York for her daughter to study. In 1992, she met the granddaughter of the fourth Philippine president in a ski resort. They had an argument which led to a big fight. Mrs. Dewi threw a champagne glass on her face. The granddaughter got hit and needed 37 stitches on her face, which left her a permanent scar. Mrs. Dewi was then sentenced to prison for the crime of injury. Afterwards, she described in a media interview, life in the prison was as happy as in a college dorm. Mrs. Dewi never cared how people thought about her. When she turned 53 years old, she posed for a book of photographs that was published in Japan. It was known as Madame Dasuka. Some of the images were partially naked. This book was banned in Indonesia. Many Indonesians accused her of insulting the noble surname Sukarno. In her later years, she decided to return to Japan. She became an editor-in-chief of a weekly magazine, the Japanese version of Point de Vue Japon. She also developed the charity business by establishing the Earth Aid Society. Later, she began to make appearances in the media. Her outspoken personality captured many people's attention. In an interview with a Japanese magazine, she talked about love relationship. She said, love can be bought with money, as long as life is safe. If you marry a rich husband, you can live a happier life than those who worry about life every day. In 1996, when the Japanese actress Seiko Matsuda planned to launch a nude photograph, she invited Mrs. Dewi to comment on the show. Surprisingly, Mrs. Dewi said, "What a third-rate artist." Her blunt comment attracted the attention of TV producers. Since then, many variety shows invited her because of her outspoken image. In Japan, she was commonly referred to as Dewi Fujin. Now 80 years old, she still works hard. She is active in many TV shows and is willing to accept challenges such as skydiving and surfing. She also owns a YouTube channel to get closer with the younger generation. From a controversial first lady to a high-profile celebrity, Mrs. Dewi's life was a surreal experience to many people. She wrote in her autobiography, "Many think I'm a lucky Cinderella, but in fact, I put in 3 times more effort and studied 3 times harder than others. With goals, I have the motivation to move forward in life."